Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Gharapour Wernz of Franczek PC. Welcome to our webinar, No Rest for the Weary, ISBE IDPH Phase 4 Guidance in Practice. As we noted during our webinar on June 25th, 2020, we took last week off from our COVID-19 webinars in observance of the 4th of July holiday. But we know how hard school board members, superintendents, and other administrators and school committees and other educators are working to make sense of the myriad of recent joint guidance from ISBE and IDPH on Phase 4 reopening, their frequently asked question that we received from ISBE. We know there's been a lot of guidance that's been coming out at the local level as well, and that this has all raised considerable confusion and questions for schools. There really doesn't seem to be any rest for the weary as we try to figure this all out. For any of you who may have missed it, we did issue an FAQ document answering 40 of your Phase 4 reopening questions, but we realized that answering your questions wasn't enough. We need to talk about how to apply those answers in practice. So to do so, with me today are two of our regular attorney panelists, Shelli Anderson.
Hi, everyone.
And Nicki Bazer.
Hi, everyone.
And we are also thrilled to welcome two very special guests, Dr. Ken Wallace, Superintendent of Maine Township 207.
Hello.
And Dr. Hank Thiele, Superintendent of Downers Grove 99.
Hello, everyone.
Who's muted?
I shouldn't be muted. Can you hear me?
Well, that's debatable.
Yeah, well, okay.
We can hear you now. So before we jump in, mark your calendar for next week's webinar, Back to School After COVID-19, Addressing Students' Social and Emotional Needs. That's going to be on July 16th at noon. Franczek attorneys Dana Fattori-Crumley, Jennifer Smith, and Kendra Yock will be welcoming special guests Dr. Ruth Kraus, child psychologist, and Mickey Moran, an attorney specializing in representing students in special education matters. So this should be a really great conversation about social and emotional needs as we return to fall instruction. And as always, if you find yourself looking for more information, or if we're not able to get to your question today, please reach out to one of us here at Franczek for more information. Also, make sure you sign up for our alerts, which you can do on our website or by emailing allmarketing@franczek.com. And don't forget, you can find out more information about our firm and all of our webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts on our website at franczek.com. Okay, so let's jump right in. We'd like to start out by allowing our audience members to get to know our guests a little. So Ken, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your district?
So I'm Ken Wallace. I'm starting my 12th year as superintendent at Maine Township High School District 207. We are 3 high schools of 6,400 students. Our district serves 9 communities that wrap around O'Hare, literally wrap around the northeast side of O'Hare. 2 of our 3 high schools, just since the turn of the 21st century, have become majority minority high schools. I'm in my total of 16th year here. I began as the assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction. Going a little bit further back, I was a high school English teacher, journalism teacher, and then taught middle school computer science for 6 years, which really informed my journey and is how I actually met Hank Thiele. When I arrived here, I had oversight for technology, among other things, and we weren't very good. And I thought we could be really, really good. And so in my second year, I was able to hire Hank Thiele, who is a dear friend, one of my all-time favorite human beings. And we set out to really build a really good technology program. And Hank had this idea one day about, as we were trying to migrate off of our email system, to reach out to Google and ask if they had interest in partnering in the K-12 space. And that's how we became Google's first K-12 partner. But Maine is just a really cool place, and been fortunate to work with a lot of great people. We've been named one of the most innovative districts in America, and it's because we're fortunate to hire people like Hank that have helped us on that journey.
All right, and now turning to you, Hank, tell us about yourself, well, what Ken hasn't already told us, and about your district.
Well, I'm at District 99, which is in Downers Grove. The 2 largest communities we serve are Downers Grove and Woodridge, but we serve several other communities including Bolingbrook, Darien, Lisle, Oak Brook, and Westmont. So a whole bunch of communities in the western suburbs here. If you're used to Chicago, we're right where all the highways meet in the suburbs, is kind of our attendance area. We have 5,000 students across 2 high schools. So very similar to Ken, we're only a high school district here. Our demographics are about 2/3 white and 2/3 non-white. And we have about 25% low income. So pretty typical West suburban area here around the city of Chicago. My background to here is that background to get to this job, as you heard, I hung out with Ken for quite a while. I was over there with him for about 10 years before I came over here. Before that, I was a high school music and science teacher and also ran a tech department. So we very similar high schools here in Downers Grove to Maine, instructionally and innovatively. It was a very easy move. Ken set me up well to be successful here in Downers Grove.
So Grasshopper, I'm going to help you once again. One of our attendees is saying something that almost nobody ever says. They can't hear you, Hank. So you're going to have to turn your volume up.
I got to speak
Trust
up.
me, audience, no one ever says that. It just never happens.
All right. You guys are definitely going to be taking over the responsibility of keeping this lively for me. For us, I can tell. So it should be an easy day for me. So let's jump into talking about our topic for today. Hank and Ken, what are you currently thinking as far as rolling out your reopening plans?
Well, I mean, right now, what our thinking is really, can you hear me better now? I changed the adjustment. All right, so really our planning is built around 2 pieces. One, following the health guidelines and trying to prioritize that and understand the order of operations we should go in, and then figuring out how that impacts the daily schedule. I think those are the 2 pieces that are the key limiting factors in how any school returns back. Once you sort out those things, the rest of the decisions start to be able to work themselves out. So without just telling everybody where we're at, because we're not ready to be there yet, but that's where we're really focused on. And then how do you leverage having to switch from either fully in person to blended to remote, depending on what the health conditions say you should be at, and how do you maintain a great student experience while you're doing those things?
So having just gone through fully virtual learning in the spring, actually going back to the Google thing, the advantage of that is we've been doing cloud computing for well over a decade in a one-to-one environment. We've attended to making sure that our kids are connected. So that turns out to be a really huge advantage in this. We've already, like many districts, surveyed our families, and somewhere, depending on the building, between 20 and 25% of our students have already told us we're going to do virtual learning this year. So part of our model by default includes being able to deliver virtual learning for a segment of our students. Within that, however, kind of piggybacking off of Hank's, it's a math and space problem. If you're going to follow guidance about social distancing and safety protocols, we're operating in physical spaces of about 500,000 square feet, rough, big plants. And we're thinking in zones where we're thinking in like a science wing, for example, which would be a priority wing, a special education area, which would be a priority wing where we'd want to get kids in on a regular basis to do things they simply couldn't do in a virtual setting. Within that, our current thinking, and I think what's going to end up how we begin school, is we're on a hybrid block schedule. Actually, Hank and I worked on this when we were here together. But we've shifted more toward the block schedule to facilitate odds and even days, which also then helps us facilitate blending our students. So we'll have groups of students coming, for example, on an odd day and then not coming on an even day, for example. So students the ones that are coming will be coming about 2 days a week, some of them 3 days a week, some of them 5 days a week. And it's all of this matrix that you're putting together. We're going to bias or prioritize serving our neediest students, which are our special education students, our English language learners, and we're also going to triage and our neediest students from a connectivity standpoint, for example, from a resource standpoint, from food insecurity standpoint. We're setting spaces aside to get those kids into the buildings.
Yeah, and we're looking at all the same kinds of things that Ken's looking at. I just add on top of that, the other data piece we're looking at is students that we knew were not successful on their own last spring, and prioritizing getting them in or getting them other interventions because they've already proven that remote learning didn't work for them. So I'd say doing everything Ken said and then adding that layer on top of it.
So I'm looking at the questions coming in, and Courtney Orzel, who's with ISA, just asked a question about best advice for working with elementary districts. And actually, I have a standing Wednesday morning meeting with our elementary districts. And this is what, part of it is just communicating. And that's actually been really, really helpful. What are you doing? How can we help? And one of the things that we are finding, at least locally, is that our elementary districts, likely because they have a smaller N of students, seem to be going more toward right now, all students are back, which works pretty well from a high school perspective because, first of all, high school students are better equipped if they're home without parents than certainly a kindergartner or an elementary student. So that's a piece of it, but part of it is just to have standing communication so that we can find places where we can work together and assist each other, because this isn't our students, their students, they're all our students. And then another person, Tim Truesdale, asked about, is there a visual of this? Our document actually is in draft form. We're going to release it next week after we share it with the board. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to have forums for our parents to look at it and ask questions and sort of pressure test it before we come back in August and actually adopt it to help improve our tort immunity, frankly, which is the reason, one of the reasons we're going to adopt it. And then also for places where the plan might be in conflict with our board policy, approving it at the board level helps with that as well. How'd I do, Shelli?
Perfect. I'm going to actually turn it over to Nicki because one of the questions we wanted to have people to hear from is whether or not these plans are required to be adopted by the board or not. So I think Ken just generally summarized Franczek's advice on this, but I'm going to turn over to Nicki to give it another shot.
Yeah, it was the perfect segue. Thanks, Ken. Pursuant to statutes, school boards are not required to adopt reopening plans. What the statute requires is that the reopening plans are approved by the superintendent. However, we are, as Shelli alluded and Ken alluded, we are recommending that boards pass a resolution. We have a draft resolution. Those interested are happy, welcome to reach out to myself or to Shelli or Jackie to actually have the school board approve the resolution, the plan through a resolution. And there's really three reasons for that. One, as Ken alluded, and I think is very important, is that it shores up your tort immunity defense to have the board adopt these plans. Second reason that's crucial is that it makes the plans enforceable. So the idea is that you can set out in your reopening plans both your educational structure, as we've been talking about, but also your specific safety protocols, the requirements to wear masks that we're going to talk about further today, and all of those things, and they become enforceable if approved by the board. And the third piece of that is that, and some of you will note in ISBE guidance where they identify places where you might want to amend specific board policy, rather than having to go in and actually sort of hand revise every single one of your policies that might need revision, adopting your plan through board action really, the language that we've included in our resolution allows you to sort of override or augment your board policies sort of in one fell swoop with your plan rather than doing it individually. So again, not required by law, but certainly advisable.
And I don't know about you all, but they melted my heart at tort immunity strengthening. I mean, it's a Jerry Maguire moment for me. So it just touching. And if you ever needed a reason to adopt it, strengthening your tort immunity has got to be at the top of the list. And I'm only half joking about that, as Shelli knows all too well.
Well, that's also a great segue, speaking of sports, into our Jerry Maguire and sports. It's a good segue into our next question, which is, how are you planning on PE in the fall, Hank and Ken? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so when you look at PE, it's going to be a lot of the fitness and spots where kids would have to really work out, build up a sweat. You're not going to have that happening. But I see this as a great opportunity for the actual classroom portion of the PE curriculum to happen while we're face-to-face. And it's also an opportunity to augment that curriculum with some of the SEL supports and trauma-based practices, and the whole idea of full health and wellness working its way into that curriculum and supporting kids that way. That's a spot where we can find time to deliver that content that we need to and those supports that we need to.
Somewhat similar. We've actually been running virtual PE for a few years, which again, you know, we like to sandbox things here, and it turns out that sandboxing helps when you face some unprecedented times. But we're going to really focus a lot of our social emotional learning curriculum within the PE area, and otherwise PE will be in a virtual setting. Now that works really well with asynchronous learning, and our students have practiced it, our teachers have practiced it, and it's one of those, I always look for the silver lining in difficult moments. And if you're thinking about what will COVID help us, you know, for the next 5 or 10 years, it's going to help us really reimagine how time and space can be played with in schools. And so PE is going to be a good sandbox for us this year on that, to really merge some really mission critical things that we all know in terms of the mental health impacts that were happening even before COVID, but they have been exacerbated by COVID.
All right. And let's talk about some more sports, about the conflict between IHSA and ISBE guidance, which I know many of you are thinking a lot about. We know a change that just came out today. So Ken and Hank, let's talk about guidance and how you're going to handle it to get students back to playing sports.
Before we have to jump into that, I just want to make sure for those of you who have not been in front of your emails right now and don't know the change that just came out, you know, as we were preparing for this, IHSA did just come out with new guidance related to, and I'm going to just read here the changes. There can be no contact drills or physical contact among athletes. All persons must wear masks at all times, and that might even be outside with social distancing. And there's a strict 50-person limit to all indoor activities, which includes spectators. Importantly, this guidance that came out said that it has been, IDPH has not approved it yet. They have looked at it, they're waiting for approval, but it's not been approved yet. But I do think it's likely, given where they've come out before, where ISBE is, that we're going to see them approve it. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I just want to make sure before we talk about how you're going to handle it, everyone out there understands kind of what the new rules likely are.
Well, it'd be nice to just get some guidance that all connects, and that ISBEs and IHSA and IDPH all made sense together. And when you fold in sports at school, you need to fold in their youth sports guidance, because this guidance is far more stringent than the youth sports guidance that you're seeing for kids out on baseball fields following right now, or not following right now. So I think a major challenge we're seeing in Illinois with the guidance is people's confidence in what we're supposed to do is getting weakened every time we get conflicting guidance. And it's lowering the confidence in people returning to school or activities, or in actually following any of it. So if they could actually all get on the same page, it would make everybody's job easier.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, we've kind of known, I'm on several regular calls with superintendents, and even when we started surveying, someone asked about surveying. We've been actually surveying students, staff, parents regularly about a host of topics. But the very first set of surveying that we did, we got as much back from parents about whether or not we were going to have sports than we did whether or not we were going to have school, which says something. And it's really, really difficult. And speaking perfectly candidly on this call, as we just watch what we can observe right now with the NFL, with NBA, with Major League Baseball. The other day, Chris Bryant, I was listening to WGN, and Chris Bryant came on and was talking about, I was really in favor of playing baseball, but now that we're just doing training, the easy stuff, if we can't get that right, how in the world are we going to pull off, doing baseball, playing games? And in the context of schools, think about what that means, because if pro baseball teams that have really incredible resources and have all these testing protocols and the ability to do it and turn it around really quickly for just a few dozen people, how then do I model something for 3,000 lives that, for example, that would be eligible to come into Maine South on a given time? So the complexity factor that we're dealing with is exponentially higher. And as I think Hank was kind of alluding to, we're a little bit of a political football in a lot of this, because there's a ton of pressure on schools to get back at it. And I get that, I understand that, but I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around needing to social distance for 6 feet for a science class, needing to have PPE, but yet having an expectation that we're going to play tackle football on Friday night. Those two things don't really seem to work at anything other than cross purposes with each other.
Yeah, and I will add to that just to illustrate the complexity, as most people on this call probably understand, is MLB is worried about baseball. And that small group, there's a lot more sports than football going on at the start of the season, that you're going to have to juggle all the conditions for each of those, while you're juggling all the conditions for each curricular area as well. It's just a lot to put on the plate. And, it is July 9th. And the fact that we're still getting changing guidance on July 9th doesn't make returning to any of this give me high confidence that we're going to be able to do it safely.
Now, as we just talked about one example of some conflicts that we've been hearing between guidance documents, and that is, a really big issue. So I want to dig into that a little bit more. One of the questions we received is, what if a local health department guidance is inconsistent with the ISBE IDPH joint guidance, for instance, regarding social distancing and face masks and shields? Shelli, can you tell us about the legal significance of this?
So I think that one of the key things here is to make sure that you're looking at what the guidance actually says, because I think that there has been given so much discretion and local control, while there's certainly this idea of what's best practice. And if we could all stay with, outside of 6 feet of one another, wearing a mask outside, that would be the best case scenario for us to make sure that people did not get sick. It's obviously not realistic. So I think when we receive this question, you really have to drill down and determine what is the guidance. So ISBE says keep 6 feet apart as much as possible. The CDC says if feasible. I know that, we look at that and we say, I know that DuPage just came out last night with a letter to their superintendents related to, yes, 6 feet is standard practice, but if you have specific and unique circumstances that require it, there can be this exception for having kids closer than 6 feet together. The reason this is so significant is because some school opening plans are not feasible if we cannot put kids in the classroom closer than 6 feet together. So what I would recommend is to make sure that you're in line with kind of what your local health department says. And I understand that Will and Kendall and Kane County might all be coming out with something soon, so be on the lookout for that. Is to make sure that you're identifying in your reopening plan, if you have to have the kids closer than 6 feet together, address why, address where your priority is or what else you're doing to keep kids safe in that environment, how you're having desk space and things like that, just so that if it's ever questioned, you have something to fall back on to explain why you went that way. My hope is that IDPH puts out something very specific that overrides everything, that you can all just look to and say, especially for those of you who've got schools in different counties, so you don't have one set of rules in one school and one set in another. Rumor is that's coming out this week too, but hopefully it's not Friday at 5, but we'll see.
Well, that's been one of the challenges all along, is who are we supposed to listen to? You have CDC, IDPH, local health department. You've got every group of doctors releasing their own guidance, and every talk show host, and parents are coming to us with that as, look, this medical professional said X. So you should do this because I agree with it. And it's hard to argue with them because we don't have any official guidance from anybody above us that says, this is the one. This is the one set of guidance in priority order, right? Like the most important thing is pick one: masks, 6 feet of social distancing, hand washing, air circulation. Like, what is the number one thing? And then after that, it's this. And then after that, it's this. Because if you pick a different one, you end up with a different program. Like if Ken puts masks above social distancing and I put social distancing above masks, even though we're both high school districts with 500,000 square feet and very similar programming and very similar student bodies, Ken's school looks very different than my school, right? And then Ken and I have to spend the next 6 months explaining why we picked what we picked rather than doing our jobs.
Right. And usually we would be able to tell you, we as the lawyers would be able to look at the different jurisdictions and tell you this is who you should listen to in this circumstance. And usually our advice would be along the lines of, you know, if you have multiple entities that have control over you, that you're going to defer to whatever the most conservative is. So if somebody says you must have students 6 feet apart in the classroom, you would have kids 6 feet apart in the classroom. But a big problem with all of this guidance is that it's not really phrased as mandates. It's if feasible, it's if possible. And so it really leaves open a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it's really, and we've gotten some questions about enforcement, because I think some local health officials have indicated that they have like legal enforcement. And so we've been sort of having this running joke about the fact that there's no actual public health jails out there, although I've had now multiple superintendents indicate that they would like to be placed in such a jail for the duration so they did not have to figure out their reopening plans. Hank is going to also volunteer for that. So I think that's right. And Hank, the bar that you set of just having guidance that's consistent seems so reasonable, right? And so I think, you know, again, our hope is that IDPH comes out. And I think the real difficulty here is because it's not enforcement that really is at issue. What's at issue is people's health and safety. And obviously school officials are brilliant and amazing people, but they're not health officials. And so I think at this point, as we've been suggesting, you know, look to your local, look to the most conservative, try to construct your plans around that. And again, hopefully we'll get a little bit more consistency coming out. And I think a lot of it is just reflective of the unknowns, right? We don't know what's going to happen, but we are just going to do the best we can to keep our kids and our employees safe.
Well, and the health officials keep couching things, and so does ISBE with the if possibles or if you can or whatever. But ultimately, somebody has to make the call, and that's falling on local superintendents to have to make that call. And we are not health professionals. So, you know, you're asking us to just do what's right for your school district, but who are we to decide what is the most pressing health consideration in all of this?
And normally I'd be the last person to say, okay, what's everybody else doing? That's usually the opposite move that I would make. But in this particular context, it really is to the whole guidance piece of it. There really ought to be extremely uniform guidance that is explicit and clear, that people know what, you know, what's the playing field. Because what Hank just described, what that opens up is, you know, I have a district right next to me that announced early on, we're all swim, everybody's coming to school. Well, when we are contiguous, you know, my parents know that, and so that creates this pressure, and that's just 2 contiguous districts. So just extrapolate outward from there. And if there's all of this variance within the system, it creates this whole extra political dynamic that I think is avoidable by having clear, explicit guidance on this. So, you know, that's the unfortunate part of this. I don't know. I know one of you guys are tracking Shelli or Jackie or Nicki the questions, but there's a couple of good early questions that are somewhat related to this. Like Blair Nuccio asked about, you know, the daily temperature checks. And I actually don't think those are required. You can do those, but that's another example of what are the rules. And we personally right now don't think that we would be doing personally at the building. So lining up 2,000 kids and taking temperature or whatever, we actually don't think we'd be doing it. And then Tom Hernandez asks about the status of the Darren Bailey lawsuit, which might be related to this as well in terms of the constitutionality of masks. I don't even know anything about that. I'm hoping one of the lawyers does. Or maybe I just set you up to fail. I did not intend to.
Well, we're going to get to a number of those questions, including the status of the lawsuit if we have time at the end. What I did want to mention, though, and I think we can hear from both of you, that level of frustration of not having consistency. And what we have done, I think, we noted it in the FAQ that we put out, is we've posed a number of questions to ISBE and IDPH to try to get some very concrete answers around some of this. Some of it around the self-certification issue and really what you can and cannot do, because there are so many variations of this. And we've got some specific questions that we'll address later. One thing I really did want to point out, though, is that there is a difference in IDPH and ISBE in terms of how they define close contact. And the reason that that's important is because that goes to who has to self-quarantine. So for instance, ISBE says that if you are within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes of someone with COVID symptoms or who's suspected of having COVID, you have to quarantine. IDPH says if you're within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes of someone who has COVID, you have to isolate. So if you're all thinking about your classrooms, the symptoms of COVID are not, as Nicki likes to say, blue polka dots on your skin. It is what every kid has. It's a runny nose, it's diarrhea, it's a headache, it's a, it can be a temperature, but usually not a temperature. So when we look at it like that, you have to identify who is actually going to have to quarantine, and that's really going to affect your plans and whether you're going to have to deal with this constant, influx of teachers and kids in and out because someone in the class sneezed, near someone else. So those are the questions that we're hoping to get answers to. We know it's July 9th. We're working toward it and hoping to get an answer for you guys soon. And I know that we've got a lot of questions about masks like that. So,
and we've done a lot of complaining about it, but I think the solve for where we're at as superintendents right now is to try to balance those against one another. Like, how does social distancing work with contact tracing? So can you contact trace? Are you in a spot where groups of kids are together and that same cohort of people are together, so it's very easy to contact trace? Well, then maybe you can cheat a little bit on the social distancing. But if you're in a setting like Ken and I, where people are moving all over the place all day, well, then you got to put a priority on social distancing, because contact tracing is not going to happen. It's just too many people moving throughout a building at one time, right? So that's the spot where we are all at as superintendents, is weighing those things together as you build your plan, because ultimately we're going to have to convince parents and students and staff that they're coming back to a safe environment, and you got to be able to rationalize the choices that you have made and justify them.
Yeah.
And the solutions look different depending on the context. One of my elementary superintendents on our call yesterday morning said that what she would do is like take a 5th grade class. Now, normally that 5th grade class might move between social science and English to math and science, in other periods. What she will be able to do is keep that class confined and move the teachers. Well, that's a solve that Hank and I don't really have available for us, because we don't have sort of those homogeneous classes. A kid may be in math class this period and with a whole different cohort in another class another period. So there's all of these, variables that each setting has a little bit of difference, but the rules for engagement ought to look the same regardless.
Yeah, and I think you raise, what Shelli was talking about in terms of how you define close contact becomes extremely important, I think, particularly for our high school districts, because as you said, like if someone's in a 3rd grade class, conceivably you just move the entire 3rd grade class on to remote learning with the teacher, and the problem is solved for those days. Not to say that that's easy and that our elementary districts don't have those hurdles as well, but it becomes infinitely more complex when you have a kid who's traveling into 6 different high school classes, and you then quarantine those teachers, and if you put them remote, are all the kids that were in the other sections also remote then? So I do think clarification on that particular point is going to be crucial in terms of how many people you have to exclude. And Hank, I know we've talked about this in advance about, well, at some point, you just not have enough staff in a building, right, and you have to go to a complete remote learning simply because everybody's quarantined.
Yeah, once we talked about the order in which you build your plan earlier, that it's the health guidelines and the schedule. The next thing in your plan is really got to be staffing, right? And understand What do you do when a teacher's out for one day? What do you do when a teacher's out for a long period of time? If you're doing blended, what are you doing for in-person learning and remote learning with a sub, right? Are they able to keep teaching from home or not? What do you do if somebody just goes off the grid suddenly? How do you get into their remote classrooms? How do you, like, so, you know, the order of operations for planning here, that would have been a nice thing to get from the experts as well, but we're kind of figuring this out as we go through. But it's almost like every answer is exposing a million more questions and solve fors as you work your way through this.
Yeah, so one of those questions that we have been getting a lot of that we've been grappling with is whether face shields can be used in place of cloth coverings or masks. So what's the latest on that issue? Shelli, can you tell us?
Sure, and I know Hank and I have been talking quite a bit about this, and I'll be interested to hear what they both have to say in terms of their plans. But, you know, I think as you all know, ISBE initially said that yes, they could be used kind of interchangeably. I think that was on the 25th. The 30th, they came out and said, no, they actually can't be used interchangeably because it's not as protective. A face shield not as protective as a face covering. I don't know how many of you have seen those masks, but some of the masks that hang real loose on your face, I don't think those are any more protective than a face shield would be, certainly as my teenager's wearing it around, and how he and his friends wear it. But I think that the piece that ISBE then said was, no, they can't be used, but maybe if video is not helpful in a particular situation, and the language they use is needed for facial, if possible, for facial visualization for instruction and communication, if you need it for that. Now, I don't know about you, but I think most it can't be communicated without being able to see my face. If I went like this, I think you'd lose a lot of what I had to say and what I meant by it. So I think, you know, I'm concerned there. I understand the reasoning behind it, but I worry that that might take our districts back to, well, then remote just makes most sense there. So I don't know. I mean, hey, Ken, I'm not sure what your plans are with respect to that piece of it.
Yeah, we're working through that as to how long students need to wear masks and in what situations, and trying to get some real clarity from our local health department of, all right, is 6 feet, if you're further than 6 feet apart and you're in the same space, do you need to have the same, wear a mask on? Is, if that space is an office, you know, that's a certain size, do you wear it all the time? If it's a small classroom, a large classroom, the gymnasium, you know, if I'm 40 feet apart from another person in the gym, do we both need to have a mask on because we're in the same indoor space? These are the granular questions that we're trying to work through. We are ordering for all of our students face shields and masks so that we have both layers of protection, because the shield protects you from others, the mask protects what you're doing to others. Just to be super covered and super safe as we return. But for how long and in what situations you have to wear those, we're still kind of holding off on the deciding, do you always have to have both on? At what points could you take a mask break? Is that only outside? Is that when you're 7 feet, 10 feet, 40 feet away from another person? Because we do know that wearing a mask for 5 or 6 hours is a challenging thing for anybody to do. And there becomes a point of diminishing returns, right? Where it just becomes so uncomfortable and in such a spot where kids and staff will just remove them anyway. And, you know, what good is that? You know, so it's a balance.
Right, and what do you do if they do take it off or refuse to wear it? What's the answer then?
So we're ordering reusable face masks for all of our students and staff. We are also planning on feeding students, which we heard this morning from one high school that they're going to try to set their schedule up so that they're not feeding anybody. The nature of our district, we're actually still feeding students over the summertime, and our community's raised almost $100,000 to even give gift cards to our families in need. So we don't see that as even something we're going to entertain. We're going to try to, you know, keep our students fed, but that's an example. You know, you're clearly taking off your mask. Now, what we are also looking at right now, our current plan calls for bringing food to the classroom instead of having students traveling like to a cafeteria. So that's a whole other solve that, you know, we've got to work out with our cafeterias to deliver food in person out into classrooms. Well, who supervises that? If I'm in a, you know, if I've got, you know, 800 kids in a cafeteria, I can supervise that with 3 or 4 staff members. But if I'm sending food out to 70 classrooms or 100 classrooms, who's supervising that? So those are some of the, as Hank just said, some of the granular details. And then what do you do with fine arts? Okay, a band program, an orchestra program, something Hank used to be involved in. I don't know about you, and Hank is the subject matter expert on this, but I don't think I could play a clarinet even if I didn't have a mask on, but I sure can't do it with a mask on. So what happens there? Is that orchestra fully social distance? Because now that changes, you know, your ability to have that type of a class.
Well, and we had a question too about something related, which was classes like shop or car repair or ceramics or robotics and kind of what comes into play there. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'll take the band and choir one, since that is my background. There are a couple of independent studies that should be coming out within the next week here that are being run by a couple of universities that are looking at moisture droplets related to wind instruments and singing. So at least in our district, we're holding off to wait to see what the results of those are, so we can use the science to drive what we do curricularly around that. Right now, it doesn't look like it's a safe practice, especially singing, right? Singing does not look like it's a safe practice indoors right now. And then so far as the other areas, I think the best thing we can do is work with, once we build the rules of social distancing, scheduling, lunch, all of those things, staffing, then I think you got to get those people in and start saying, here's the structure. You're the curricular experts. What do you think you can do in here? And how can we support you to, you know, teaching kids in the best way possible under these conditions?
Kind of same thing here. I mean, we will blend. You know, if you just start with some basic premises, which is start with social distancing. Even though our music areas are larger classrooms, it's a math problem. How many kids could you safely fit in there? And then if you know, our band in one of our buildings alone is over 200 students. Well, those kids will be in shifts, and now, you know, you start with your core academics, which are how we would do the splits for those odds and even days that we're thinking. How does that then intersect with those kids who are in orchestra? So you're putting a matrix together. And, you know, the bottom line is, on a piece of this, I think we all know this, even if we're not saying it out loud, but some of this is you're going to do the very best you can to serve as many kids as you can in as many ways as you can, knowing full well that it is not going to be perfect. And, you know, you set out to do the very best you can. You learn every single day about, you know, you discover some things that you didn't know going into this, and you just keep, you know, you treat this like school. You keep learning. And I think that's the best advice any of us can have. And just, you know, it's the extended grace that I think we're all going to need to get through this.
Yeah, I think the one thing, I think what both of you are saying makes perfect sense in terms of kind of what the best ideal situation would be and how to handle it in this very unideal world that we're in right now. But I think that the question comes back to, you know, we are going to have kids in our buildings that either refuse to wear a mask or can't wear a mask. And I think the one place that all the guidance is clear on is that you are not to be within 6 feet of someone if you are unable to or cannot wear a mask. And so one thing that we're hearing a lot about is, you know, how do we handle parents who are calling saying, maybe not for medical reasons, maybe for political reasons, that they do not want their child to have to wear a mask. And I think the question that Tom Hernandez raised earlier about, you know, the pending lawsuit as to whether or not there's a constitutional right to not wear a mask. And I think that's certainly going to be decided by the courts. We have our own opinions about that, and we don't have time to get into them here. But in terms of, you know, how you handle it, you know, our guidance really is that both with respect to a teacher or student, if someone comes to you saying that they can't wear a mask, you want to get medical certification as to why, and that's consistent with ISBE guidance, to make sure that you really press them and find out, because we don't want people who otherwise are able to wear them to be around, really, because you've got to remember, as one of you alluded to, you're wearing the mask to protect other people from you. So if you have someone who just doesn't want to wear it, they're really putting everybody else at risk more than they're putting themselves at risk. We did have a question come in our Q&A here about, where do you put those kids? So let's say you do have a handful of students who medically are compromised and can't wear a mask. And that's something that we're really working through right now. And I think it depends on what your plan is. So for instance, is there a place in the classroom further back that those kids can be? Can you put a shield of some sort around that student's desk if they can't otherwise wear some sort of any other protective face covering? Questions that we've received of, can you force them to be remote learners? Can you put them in a separate classroom? I think we are likely to see a lot of disability discrimination lawsuits if we are otherwise excluding them solely for that reason. Nicki, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on kind of that piece of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, what we typically would never advise is to sort of set up a shield around a kid to highlight the fact that they do or don't have a disability. These are obviously really extreme times, which is why we're trying to figure out how to navigate students in a classroom who just physically cannot wear a mask. And I do think it is a conversation with parents, if you do have a component of your program that is remote, about discussing with the parents whether that is the best option for the student, because obviously you are protecting that child from other kids from the child who can't wear them, but also without a mask, they're not potentially protected, and they may have other underlying health conditions that make remote learning more feasible or better for them from a health perspective. So I do think making sure that you're in communication with families about it, and trying to first figure out, can you accommodate it within the structure that you have in the classroom, and if not, is that something that you need to accommodate at home? And each of these is obviously going to be somewhat individualized.
Could we talk a little bit more about just a legal opinion? Because there's one thing about I can't wear it, and obviously our go-to move there is always going to be to accommodate, but that versus I refuse to wear it. I mean, and I would think that, and especially if we were adopting our plans, with the board, and our condition was, people wear PPE, so we start there as a foundation. What kind of ability are we going to have to sort of enforce that for someone? I mean, obviously someone that has a genuine medical condition that would preclude that, that's one thing, but folks who might genuinely say, my kid's not wearing PPE and they are coming to school. So I think that's going to be tested.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And yeah, just to put a period on the accommodation issue, some of these students also, of course, will have a 504 or an IEP to begin with, and so that's a great process to convene the team to talk about all of these issues, including masks. But right, Ken, there's definitely going to be those kids, as we talked about earlier, who are refusing, or their parents are refusing. And part of the reason that we are suggesting that the plans are adopted by boards and are enforced, to make them enforceable, is that you may need to go down the route of excluding kids either in a if they're not wearing masks and not based on a medical reason. And I think there's some complexity to that issue, so something to talk through with council before you start down that road. And it may be sort of a hybrid, like, we're going to keep you remote. It's also somewhat like a disciplinary, there may be process that you need to provide. But that may ultimately be where some districts need to land if there is just a consistent refusal, because again, we're talking about protection for all kids and staff.
We do want to be sure you all are aware, though, we have started to see the fake forms that people are submitting saying that they are excluded from wearing a mask, and they look real. They look like they have a Department of Justice stamp on it or something from the state of Illinois. We did hear about that a lot, because the New York Times had an article about it, and there was some discussion, and I think it's on the DOJ's website, but they are starting to come in. So just making sure that you're not taking those at face value. One of our partners did find one that indicated there was an exclusion from wearing pants to work. So they're being modified in many ways.
Shelli, you were not supposed to share that. That was confidential, okay? It's not to be shared in this forum. I'm disappointed.
We just want to make sure people are aware, Ken, of what they should be looking for. Well, I wasn't identifying you as the source of it. But I just want to put people on notice that these are coming, in from parents who likely either know that they're fake, or that they're working with doctors who also have political reasons for not, thinking kids should wear masks. So,
and just to be clear, we did confirm that Ken is wearing pants. So yes. We're all set.
We did actually all confirm that we were wearing pants. So you can.
All right, Jackie, what's next?
All right, so let's talk about a little bit more about self-certification. I know Ken mentioned it earlier, but I know people are really interested in this. So how do we handle self-certification? What's your plan, Hank? What are you thinking?
So, well, first I'm hoping that our attorneys find a way to get it for a duration period of time, whether that's 1 week at a time or until the rules change again or something like that. So we could have a self-certification upfront. Because as Ken said, if you're bringing back 1,000, 2,000 kids plus staff on a single day, it makes it really challenging. We've been working through it. We've been talking to some of our other local schools. Really, the way I look at it is, if you're going to do the solution of self-certification and you're not going to take their temperatures as they come through the door, which that itself is fraught with challenges, because we see it with our athletes that are returning right now. If they're standing out in the sun waiting to be tested, they're all testing hot because they were standing in the sun. Then we got to move them into the shade or into the air conditioning, and then they're fine, right? So and then once it gets cold out, everybody with the temperature is going to test normal, right? So that whole piece is fraught with danger. If you do the self-certification, I think you're looking at two directions. One is a digital solution where a parent signs into an app and clears a kid for the day, and the kid brings in their smartphone and shows that they've been cleared, and that's their pass through the door. There's a whole bunch of equity issues that I have as concerns with that, with data plans and phones and everything else. Or you go the analog version, and we're looking at both solutions. I believe Glenbrook has developed an app or is working on an app, and we're reaching out to them. There's a bunch of vendors that have reached out to us with solutions around that. But we're also talking to our local printer about just making a booklet of certifications, and a parent in the morning would check the box that says, my kid doesn't have a temperature, they don't have any of these symptoms, they sign it, they give their kid their little slip, and when they show up to the bus, they show their slip, they get on the bus, come to school, they show the slip, they get in the school door. At any of those spots, if they don't have the slip or don't have the app, then you're going to have to certify their temperature if you're going to follow these guidelines as they are.
And I would love for any of the viewers, if you get the Epstein has a note from his mother reference, identify yourself in the chat box. Most of you will have no idea what that means, but that's the plan that Hank just outlined. It's Epstein has a note from his mother. He's cleared to come to school. I'm hopeful that, there'll be a more elegant solution. And my calculus on this is, so if you play all the scenarios out, temperature isn't bulletproof. In fact, students can have a temperature and not be symptomatic for COVID. And they can, in fact, it's highly likely that they could be symptomatic for COVID and not have a temperature. So the temp thing at the door doesn't have a lot of, efficacy to it. Similarly, if we're really trusting our parents to sort of verify the things that they would normally make judgments about whether or not to send their students, I think that has as much reliability as anything. And similar to how we would use a acceptable use policy, in practice, I think that's the most efficient thing for schools. And that's why I'm advocating. I hope there's somebody from ISBE on today hearing this wisdom being extolled so that they will allow us to have sort of this, sign on so that we can, make this piece of our puzzle a lot simpler without, I don't think, reducing any kind of safety for us. And I see that the only people that are admitting say they saw reruns. That's not really fair. I know somebody on actually saw it live back in the day. Somebody did anyway.
Ken, I hate to tell you, you're getting old.
It is true. It is true.
But I'm still trying to get there. So yeah. You've accomplished something I haven't.
Yeah.
So just to put a period on this, because we did get a question about the idea of just kids showing up to school as sort of self-certifying if they arrive at school that they have self-certified. We have been told by ISBE that is not sufficient in no uncertain terms. That, again, as Ken was alluding, it seems to us that if you are going to do self-certification at home, the idea of a kid sort of presenting at school or swiping their ID or coming with a tag if they're a elementary student seems like it would make a whole lot of sense. At this point, we're not convinced that ISBE is allowing that process. They've, again, been clear to us that just like the idea of a kid showing up at school being self-certification is not sufficient. Hopefully we'll see, we've asked that question as well of ISBE, and hopefully we'll see some guidance, because I think, as Ken has alluded and Hank is expressing, like this this piece of it is so logistically complicated for schools. And it seems like it shouldn't have to be.
Yeah, and that's particularly true when you think about that it's also a requirement with respect to transportation. So before a kid gets on a bus, we're supposed to either make sure that they've self-certified. And I know that we've heard from some school districts that bus companies are pushing back on what do we do if a kid doesn't self-certify, or if, you know, they do have a temperature. And we know it's not necessarily feasible for every school to put an adult employee of the school district on the bus to help kind of navigate these things. So there is a lot of complication, and I think we are hopeful that ISBE is going to step in and give us some more guidance on that. I do want to just say it is obviously 12:58 right now. We have so many questions. We received a record number of questions in the registration process, and so those are the ones that we've been working through. We've got a ton of questions in our Q&A right now as well. So we are going to keep talking, so feel free to stay with us while we work on this a little bit longer. But always remember that if you have to jump off, or if there's another person in your organization who didn't get to see this, that all of our webinars are available on our website as a link to YouTube. So you can always come back and hear the end there if you need to.
Hey, Jackie, the one thing I wanted to say about the whole self-certification piece, just so I know we have a lot to move on to also, is that the piece that concerns me the most about it is that this is something that could be the reason that schools aren't able to go back, or really a stumbling block. And when you really think about it, should it be? You know, the research shows that most kids who have COVID don't have temperatures, and that these other pieces do not always show up in kids in terms of being symptomatic. So to me, the fact that there is being put so much emphasis on this, where the CDC's guidance is to do it if feasible. They don't even say it's mandatory. So more than ISBE coming out with something, I'm really hoping that IDPH and ISBE can work together to say, look, this cannot be the reason we don't put kids back. And that's not because it's, you know, we shouldn't be safe and we shouldn't expect parents to do this at home. We've got to trust our families. They want their kids back in school. They need to play a role in it. And part of the role they need to play in it is commit that they're going to do this at home before they put their kids on the bus or in our school building. So hoping for some change in that.
Absolutely. So we received a lot of questions, and I know we had a lot of questions beforehand about what to do when staff members get sick. So I think we should touch on that a little bit right now. So if you've got a staff member who's potentially been infected, Shelli, can you just speak to in what cases can the school employer require an employee to take a test or self-quarantine, those types of things?
Sure. So, I mean, pursuant to the EEOC, we can require a COVID test. We can't require an antibody test. But in terms of if a teacher or staff member is exposed to COVID, obviously following the IDPH guidelines, and they need to go home and self-isolate for 14 days, and the people who've been in close contact with them, depending upon which definition you're looking at, also need to be home checking for symptoms and self-isolating. Then it really comes down to, you know, what happens to that teacher in terms of their benefits. Are they getting paid during that time, or are they not getting paid? So remember that the, you know, emergency leave benefits under the FFCRA are still in effect through the end of December. I think we're likely to see that extended. You know, unfortunately, as school district employers, you don't get reimbursement for the money you have to pay out under that. And one of the questions that we did receive was, you know, what happens if our teachers, if their per diem is more than $511 a day? How do we handle that? And they're actually being penalized if we cap it at that. And so, you know, two things that I will say that I've seen districts handle this is, one, entering into an MOU with their union saying that although we are not required to, we will pay them their full per diem. In other instances, I've seen them permit the teacher to take a partial benefit day to allow them to get their full per diem during that period of that 10 days when they need to stay at home. So I caution all of you that this all has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, and that the idea of someone being exposed and actually testing positive versus all those requests we're getting for, I don't feel comfortable coming back to school, I am over 65, I have an underlying medical condition, those are handled completely differently. And you have to make sure that your HR department, whoever's handling those inquiries, understands the complexities and the nuances of that as you move forward throughout the school year.
We're even starting to get some requests for leave of absences from people that don't have underlying conditions, you know, and I get it, but I'd say the most common type is it's a young mother who's got a few, you know, couple of kids at home and just, you know, would rather, you know, take the year and get a leave of absence. So, you know, start adding some of those into these questions in terms of the complexity piece, because I think what we're going to find this year. And so the question I'm actually wrestling with right now, having just gotten a few of these, is do we just grant the leave of absence, which they're eligible for, and so we normally would do for reasons we have limits on that, or do we try to create a situation where that teacher, instead of a leave of absence, maybe still teaches, but they're teaching remotely from home. So they're in our remote teaching pool, just like we've got a pool of remote kids. So it's you know, that's a piece of the matrix that we're thinking about. Is that better for our kids than trying to hire a long-term sub? So, I mean, add that to the piece of the puzzle. And does that solution beget more of those requests? So it's just all of these kind of things that we're wrestling with.
So, you know, all of this talk about how do we and how can we, you know, this brings up the point that I've been wrestling with greatly, and I think we need to clarify for everybody we're going to be asked coming back that has concerns and everything else. We have been so focused since March about how can we do this and how can we bring people back. I think as part of everybody's planning process, they need to stop the can we, and for a moment, start on another sheet of paper of why should we? Why should we bring kids and staff back to school? We need to be prepared to speak to the why first to everybody. Why is it important that we get kids back to school? You know, what are your priorities? How are you going to do that? You know, this sticks in my head. I shared this with everybody on the call yesterday. It keeps sticking in my head because I used to be a chemistry teacher as well, and we used to teach about the development in nuclear chemistry of the development of the atomic bomb. And all of the scientists that worked on that project, when they were interviewed afterwards, they just kept saying that. We were so focused on could we that we never stopped to ask ourselves, should we? And I think if we're going to do this effectively as educators, we need to be able to speak to that to our communities, to our parents, to our staff first. Why are we bringing people back? What is gained by that? What is the importance of that? And we know it's important. We know why we bring kids to school every day, but lead with that. We have to tell everybody the why before we get to the how, and give yourself some time to write that out and be able to speak passionately about why you think it's important that kids and staff are back together every day, and how that's about building relationships, and how that's so important to checking if kids are okay and that they have the resources that they need to learn before sometime that we go back to remote learning. You know, I've started with my leadership team to put together the why, so we can lead with that before we get to the how.
And just to piggyback off that a little bit, Hank, one of the conversations we've been having here, just as we're building sort of our model of the blended format with the kids, where we're blending the kids in and out, we actually think even if a teacher is only seeing that kid once a week, which is what our current model calls for, that interaction enhances then the next interaction virtually. And it's this cycle that sort of perpetuates itself, because that's a whole different sandbox than what we just got through, which was everybody's virtual. Now, the advantage we had in March was that we'd had a couple of months of in-person class, but we won't have that advantage now. And so that incoming freshman who's brand new to Downers Grove or brand new to one of the main schools, you know, has to build that relationship with teachers somehow, not just for the in-person, but for the virtual piece of it.
You also have new teachers, right? And new staff, and they need to build relationships with their teams to be effective as well. So there's some real key reasons why it makes sense to start trying to get people back in a safe format under however the guidelines piece together in your physical space and your community. But I think we make a huge mistake if we don't share those reasons with our communities.
Such a great point, and I think a really good point for us to end on. I know that we weren't able to get to everything, so please reach out to us. We are here, all of us and our colleagues here at Franczek are here to answer your questions, so please contact us at any time. Ken and Hank, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
It's great to hang out. I'm going to go, think about tort immunity for the rest of the day. Top of mind, I'm going to drive away happy knowing that my tort immunity here is going to be strengthened. And it's always good to hang out with this whole crew here. Some of my favorite peeps.
Yeah, any day with Dr. Wallace is a good day.
Agreed.
Guys.
And thank you to all of you who stuck it out. I can see a very large number of you stuck it out to the very end. So thank you so much. And as always, please catch up with all of our webinars on our website. And until we see you next week, please stay safe and take care. Thank you, everyone.